Dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests, dear friends, welcome to this lecture, guest lecture with our guest Angela Bourne. Very happy to have you here. This lecture has several functions, so to say, but I'll mention one here, which is the ValEUs project, a Jean Monnet policy network, which is on European values, in particular on the distinction or gap between practices of the European Union and the values the EU has set up to follow. Yeah, so our starting point is that there is a gap, for example, in migration policy, for example, with regard to rule of law in some places, but not only these areas. And the values network has different ways of doing research, doing collaboration, and one of them is inviting scholars from other universities. So Angela is from Roskilde University, close to Copenhagen in Denmark. And actually, I would invite you to say a few words about that university. It is known. It is a high-profile university, high-profile research university from my point of view. But it has also gained a certain status of relevance for us because we are talking about reforming our study program, and Roskilde is actually one university where there is interesting things going on. Of course, you talk mainly about your topic, but maybe you can say a few words on that as well. The speech is hosted by ValEUs, but also by the Institute for Europastudien, IFES. We're happy to collaborate again. And so let me very quickly introduce Angela Bourne. Angela or Angela? Angela, probably, yeah?
Angela, yeah.
Angela, yeah. So Angela is at the Institute for Social Science and Business at Roskilde University. She has a BA from Queensland University, which is, I guess, in Brisbane, in Australia. I looked it up and saw that very close is Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, which is why we took you along the Oder River today to get some contrast. We have a Polish coast, if you wish. She did her MA then in the UK and a lot of her further activities in the United Kingdom, Lancaster University, University of Bristol, where she had her PhD, and then worked in Dundee and the University of Aberystwyth in Wales or in the United Kingdom. So her research and teaching expertise is on comparative European politics and European Union studies, and she has these projects, which she is going to tell us about, on opposition to populist parties in Europe, close to the question if the EU is a militant democracy or if there are some elements of militant democracy which can be employed, which are employed, which should be employed. ValEUs is a network of 20 universities. We meet sometimes online, sometimes in person, and for me personally, it's the most interesting thing to see if at other universities issues being worked on which are relevant for us today. I don't have to explain too much why resisting to populist parties is an issue in Frankfurt an der Oder or in Brandenburg or in all of the Federal Republic, in fact. So it's very clear why we are very happy to have you here. It's going to be, of course, a scientific presentation responding to populist parties. Very happy to have you here. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for
and
the
you have to talk here because of the live stream.
Okay, I will do that. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you about my research. It's always nice to come to Germany and talk about populism, militant democracy, democratic defense, because most people know what I'm talking about, because this is something that is an important topic, and a lot of scholarship on these issues have been undertaken in Germany. And that's not the case everywhere. In other parts of the world, the concept of militant democracy or democratic defense is really not as widely known as it is in Germany. What I want to talk to you about today is responding to populist parties, not just in Germany, responding to populist parties in Europe. It was completely coincidental that I came to talk to you today on the day that the world's most powerful populist, Donald Trump, was inaugurated into power. I'm not going to talk about Trump because I have not done any research about responding to populists like Donald Trump. But I think about it all the time, and I hope that you may see some connections between what I talk about and what's happening in the United States. And I'm sure that there will be lots of people talking today about Donald Trump. So I hope that I don't really need to. Okay, so there is a lot to talk about when we talk about populists in Europe and responding to populist parties. Populists are important everywhere in Europe. Some places more than other places. But in many ways, populist parties of the left and right are really a normal part of the political architecture almost everywhere in Europe. Many, many, many people vote for them. Really many people vote for populist parties. Populist parties very often lead governments or participate in governments as coalition partners or as extra-parliamentary support parties. This is really normal now in Europe. But populist politics is controversial, it's polarizing, and there are many people who disagree with populist parties, sometimes disagree vehemently. Many people, many institutions, public authorities, mobilize in the public sphere against populist parties. And many people who do this mobilize around the claim that populists are a threat or a challenge to liberal democracy. This situation is not going away. This is likely to be the political context in which democracies in Europe will exist in the short to medium term in any case. But what I'd like to do today is not so much talk about why populists have become more successful in Europe, and they have over the last 30 years. Really, you can see a trajectory of going upwards. I don't want to talk about that today. What I'd like to talk to you about is opposition to populist parties. How people who disagree with populist parties mobilize against them. And I also want to think a little bit about the idea of how can we evaluate the consequences or effectiveness of different ways of mobilizing against populist parties. This is what I've been working on for the last 7-8 years. I recently published 2 books which deal with this question. This first one here, Democratic Defense as Normal Politics, reports the findings of a research project that I conducted funded by the Carlsberg Foundation, where we mapped initiatives opposing populist parties in 7 European countries, in Hungary, Poland, Germany, Italy, Spain, Denmark and Sweden. We looked at 9 populist parties then. And with colleagues that were specialists in these countries, we sought to map how people who disagree with populists went about opposing them in the public sphere. So that's one of the things I want to speak to you about. That's the how question. How do people oppose populist parties? And in this book here, which came out in late 2023, I build on what I learned really from studying opposition strategies to try to develop a theory of how we can evaluate the effectiveness of different kinds of opposition strategies. So that's really what I want to speak to you about today. There's really 3 arguments that I want to make. I think we need to start with the question of the relationship between populism and liberal democracy. Because a lot of the time, when people mobilize, they make claims about democratic defense and the democratic credentials of populist parties. But I would argue, in fact, that this relationship is more complicated. It's much more ambiguous and more of a mixed bag. And this is an important argument to start our conversation with, because that's why we talk about populists so much. And that's why I began studying populist parties. But when there is this ambiguity about the relationship between populism and liberal democracy, designing normatively justifiable strategies of opposition, deciding which tactics to use, justifying that opposition, understanding who mobilizes and in what ways, is very much linked to understandings and varying understandings of the relationship between populism and liberal democracy. So I want to start by looking at that particular relationship. Then another argument I would like to make, and this is one of the arguments that I make in the two book projects that I just spoke to you about, is that even though there is this ambiguity in the academic literature about populism and liberal democracy, a lot of the time when people mobilize against populist parties in the public sphere, the master frame is democratic defense. That is a key argument that we came up with when analyzing the public justifications of mobilization against populist parties. And yet, even though you might expect that mobilization of this public justification might justify exclusionary and exceptional treatment for populist parties, actually, most of the time, the strategies used are those of normal politics, what I call normal politics. And so this lays the foundations for a paradigm of democratic defense as normal politics. And what I mean by normal politics is in many ways the opposite of militant democracy. And of course, militant democracy, if you live in Germany, you know that this is very much a policy, a set of public instruments, constitutional instruments for marginalizing parties that may undermine the liberal democratic basic order. It includes party bans, it includes restrictions on access to public funding, permission for surveillance of political parties, use of cordon sanitaire, extensive exclusion of parties seen to be problematic in democratic terms from joining governing coalitions. This we know very much in Germany. Normal politics is the opposite of that in many ways. It entails an acceptance of populist parties as a normal part of the political system, and the use of the kinds of repertoires typically used to deal with disagreements in democratic communities. So this can include taking a populist party in government to the Constitutional Court to prevent implementation of a policy that's problematic in liberal democratic terms. It can include taking a party to the court for corruption or for hate speech crimes. It can include cobbling together a coalition of parties in parliament to defeat legislation of populist parties or to organize a motion of no confidence. It can sometimes include forming governments with populist parties to socialize perhaps or moderate the political stance of a populist party. It can include protests, public protests, mass demonstrations, which nevertheless remain largely non-violent. It can include strikes. It can include media investigations. It can include public information campaigns. It can include a whole series of activities that use the repertoires of liberal democratic politics. similar kinds of repertoires that are used to deal with all kinds of disagreements in democratic life. So that's two of the big arguments that I would like to make and explain to you how I got to those kinds of arguments. That we should think most of the time of democratic defense as normal politics. But the second argument, or the other big argument I would like to speak to you about today, is that when we think about effective responses to populist parties, it's actually not very helpful to try to think about measures that will eliminate or totally defeat populist parties. My argument is that in practice, opponents pursue a series of consequential but less ambitious goals when they engage with populist parties. And that this ought to be a framework in which we try to understand the effectiveness of opposition to populist parties. So this is the argument that populist parties are probably too successful to completely defeat them. They do disappear sometimes, but this is unlikely to happen in the medium term in European democracies. Too many people vote for them. There are also questions about the appropriateness of trying to eliminate or defeat a political opinion in a liberal democracy, particularly an opinion that a lot of people have and support if we are to respect tolerance, principles of pluralism in a democratic society, even when we accept that there are limits to tolerance. It also acknowledges that populism comes from somewhere. It comes from people being dissatisfied with the political system that they live in. It comes from grievances that haven't been effectively dealt with in the political system, issues of trust, etc. And so my argument is that what we need to look at is not so much, we don't judge the success of opposition by looking at whether or not a populist party that was popular disappears. That's not helpful. My argument is that we need to think about instruments or initiatives that may curb the implementation of illiberal or anti-democratic politics. It's helpful to think about achieving goals such as reducing support for populist parties. It's helpful to think about measures which diminish resources that populist parties have when fighting electoral campaigns or trying to implement particular policies. And it's also useful to think about policy positions, about moderation of populist parties, and what incentives can be given to encourage populist parties to pursue less radical positions. So these are the arguments that I'd like to speak to you about and explain to you how I came to make these conclusions. So this first kind of opening argument, the idea that we need to think of opposition to populism as democratic defense. Let me say something about how we can understand populism. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's useful to be clear about what I mean. There's many debates in academia about how we define populism. This is a very popular one, and while scholars can debate it, I think what it does do is it really captures some core elements of what we're talking about when we're talking about populism. And so Cass Mudder defines populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated, and this is the key word, separated, divided into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups. The pure people, the ordinary people, the virtuous people, the natives, the people from here, the hard-working taxpayers. Society divided between this group of people who are pure and good versus the corrupt elite, the evil elite, the people who are not responsive to the needs or interests of the ordinary people, the governments, the political parties, the international organizations, media, the corporations, the intellectuals, the universities. This is the idea of two antagonistically related groups. Society is divided into these two groups of people, and there's not much that divides them, that unites them. So I think that's an important idea that is captured in most conceptions of populism. Muda and several others, but not all, also make this point about populism being a thin-centered ideology. And what this refers to is the idea that this idea of society divided between elites and the people is not a way that comprehensively describes the whole of social life. It explains an important part of it, but it is usually complemented by other more substantial ideological positions: conservatism, nationalism, socialism. And that's why we talk about left-wing populism and right-wing populism. But the populist core is this distinction between people and the elite, the good people, corrupt elite. A lot of debate among scholars concerns the relationship between populism and liberal democracy. And this is where this discussion about democratic defense really comes. A lot of scholars argue that populism is not necessarily a threat to democracy, because the appeal to the people at the heart of our conceptions of populism are indeed a strong democratic impulse. It is a claim at heart that the people are sovereign. The people are the sovereign political subject. And the people ought to be respected in the democratic process. And the government should be by the people, for the people, rather than for some unaccountable elite. And that's a very democratic idea. Some people argue that populists are very good at emphasizing the needs of excluded groups from society, groups that are not well represented, people who have ideas on topics that existing political elites don't want to talk about. And that populism is in many ways a corrective to the problems of the functioning of liberal democracies. So this is the idea that actually there's something quite democratic about populist argumentation and populist referencing of the people. This is contrasted by some other arguments that see rather negatively in relation to the democratic credentials of populist parties. An important argument is that there's something of a halfway house in terms of populist orientations to democracy. They may be democratic, and in Europe, populists are willing to go to elections, and they do indeed have democratic legitimacy in the sense that they are really a lot of the time elected in free and fair elections. But they may be democratic in certain interpretations, they're just not liberal. And so there's an argument that we should think about populists as democratic illiberals. And this is the argument that actually the democratic extremists, populists, overplay the importance of the people and do not pay enough attention to the restraints on expressions of the will of the people. Restraints that are found in constitutions, that are found in checks and balances, that are found in independence of the judiciary, in independence of the media, pluralism, and an effective opposition. So this is a critical position that also needs to be taken into account. There are other people who argue that, in fact, populism is necessarily undemocratic. So lots of different positions here. This argument, one person who makes this argument is Jan Werner Müller, and he very famously describes populism as necessarily anti-pluralist. His argument is that when populists say that they want to represent the people, they say that they and only they represent the people, and that others cannot represent the people. And so opposition, people who don't support populists, are logically excluded from the definition of the people. And so populist politics becomes identity politics, which excludes a portion of the people. And the argument is that that's not democratic, and that pluralism is a very important feature of democratic life. It requires accepting that societies are diverse, they don't always agree, but that citizens are necessarily equal in their relationship to each other. So the point of this discussion, it was really a starting point of where we started with our project. Uncertainty about what populism amounts to. And we saw this in practice as well. There were some populist parties that were really happy to operate within the constitution. In Scandinavia, where I'm based, there are parties that are rather unsatisfied with the way that democracy works, but they're not unhappy with a fairly pluralist democratic state. They are liberal, but they're not really a fundamental problem for the operation of a liberal democratic system. There are also cases where populists have been in government and they haven't really undermined the liberal democratic institutions of the country where they are. Italy has had populist parties for a very long time, and in many respects it's still a pretty functioning, good democratic system. And there's some other examples as well. So we have this ambiguity about populist orientations to liberal democracy. And we expected to see a lot more of this ambiguity in the way that people spoke about populism. But we didn't really see it. In fact, when we looked at statements, summaries of the reasons why people mobilized against populist parties, these were published in newspapers. We didn't do a discourse analysis, but we looked at summaries of the reasons why people complained about populist parties. And what we saw was that there were three different kinds of frames. One set of frames made pretty clear arguments about democratic defense, when populist parties were described as illiberal, undemocratic. What you see here is a word cloud which has weighted averages of the critical claims we saw, right? So an important part of the way they spoke about populist parties they disagreed with was by calling them illiberal, undemocratic, fascist, Nazi, authoritarian. So that's a very clear democratic defense frame. We could also identify another frame that was less directly linked to this clear democratic defense frame, and this was arguments that populist parties undermined core liberal democratic values. Populist parties are called racist or politically biased, and they're called corrupt, for example, or discriminatory or Islamophobic. So that was another kind of frame that was evident in the way that people spoke about populist parties and the data that we collected. It wasn't all the time that people used this frame. So another frame which described populist parties in undesirable terms, as people that they didn't think were good political subjects, undesirable ways of behaving, that was also there. And a lot of these words, especially the ones that are big, indicate complaints about populist parties that don't really have anything to do with democracy. Incompetent, for example. That was really commonly used. Or they behaved inappropriate, or they were immoral, or they were unpatriotic or un-European. Okay? But overall, a good number, maybe over half of the kinds of critical claims we looked at did really frame opposition as democratic defense or something like democratic defense, the need to protect core liberal democratic values. It's not the only frame, but it was a really fundamental way in which those opposing populist parties around Europe, in the 7 countries that we were looking at, really did frame the opposition. That's how that was understood. So despite this academic debate, really the argument here is that opposition is very much in the minds of people who go onto the streets, in the public sphere, initiate court cases, etc. That's how they see their opposition. So what about this argument of normal politics? When we started the research, we assumed that most countries would look more or less like Germany, where populist parties are, and like Alternative for Germany, but also predecessors. National Democratic Party, perhaps not a populist party, more of a far-right party, or Republikaner. They were subject to a fairly exclusionary kind of approach by mainstream political parties and also by important institutions of the state. We expected we'd see much more of that in other countries that we looked at. But in fact, Germany really was an outlier. And I'll show you some of the data that really shows how different the German case is compared to the other cases that we looked at. And this is because even though, of course, what we called intolerant or exceptional measures, they were an important part of the German case, and there were also tolerant and normal measures as well. It was really in the German case where we did see a substantial proportion of exclusionary, exceptional treatment of a populist party. But let me explain a little bit that argument. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we mapped initiatives opposing populist parties in 7 European countries: Hungary and Poland, Germany, Italy, Spain, Denmark, Sweden. So we looked at opposition to Fidesz, Law and Justice, Alternative for Germany, Vox, Podemos, Lega, Five-Star Movement. We also looked at Sweden Democrats and Danish People's Party. 9 parties of the left and right, and a bit hard to classify, mostly parties of the right, but quite a range of parties. Some governing, some not governing, some support parties. So that's what we sought to do. We did a survey of newspapers where we looked for evidence of acts in the public sphere by public authorities, including governments, or institutions like the courts or international organizations, by political parties, and also by civil society actors. We looked at information about international, transnational, and domestic kinds of opposition. And we got this information by a content analysis of newspapers, looking at 1 day a week over many months, and we selected time periods that were appropriate to the case. But we did collect a lot of data. We looked at over 700 months of newspapers. They varied by country. So at the top, Fidesz, we had 76 months when Fidesz was in government. In other cases, Danish People's Party, we had 105 months. The lowest was Law and Justice, where we just covered the period of government from 2015 to 2009. There was quite a substantial difference in the number of initiatives opposing populist parties that we found. We found a lot more for Fidesz and Law and Justice, probably for understandable reasons. These were countries where there were big mobilizations against the government, and where governments, these parties were in government, where they were in fact implementing some very controversial measures. In other cases, such as Danish People's Party, the proportion of months to initiatives was much lower. So this is something to do with salience, but it does show that we found a lot of information about different kinds of strategies. I think it's important to say that there are methodological challenges in terms of relying on newspaper data to collect information about initiatives opposing populist parties. I mean, there is a selection bias in terms of the kinds of initiatives that are reported. So we developed a number of strategies to deal with this, and I think it's fair to say that the kind of conclusions we draw are general conclusions. They're about general trends. We don't refer to frequencies. You see them here. But the conclusions we draw are not so much about numbers of initiatives. It's how they're concentrated and how they're spread and how they're present and absent in different countries. It's also the structure of this data is that there's quite big differences in the information we have about different countries. But that's how we collected information. We did a map, a survey of how people who disagree with populist parties in practice go about opposing them. When we recorded data, we classified these acts of opposition according to a typology. The typology distinguished between actors on one dimension, and these were the actors that I spoke about: public authorities, governments, courts, international organizations, political parties, and civil society actors. And civil society, very broad: protest movements, trade unions, rights advocacy groups, public intellectuals, unorganized groups of citizens, newspapers doing investigations, transnational organizations. So we were very, very broad in our conception. We also classified, according to a much more complicated dimension, modes of engagement. So we distinguish between intolerant and exceptional forms of engagement, and tolerant or ordinary or normal forms of engagement. I think I've said a little bit about how we distinguish those, but let me clarify the kind of coding rule, the conceptual rule we used when coding to distinguish between these different forms of engagement. So, intolerant, and we're thinking very much about militant democracy in Germany here. Intolerant modes of engagement suspend a general norm, rule, or practice of general application, which grants rights, privileges, and respect to political parties by virtue of their representative function in democratic politics, or their role as governing parties in the international sphere. So, intolerant or exceptional modes of engagement suspend those norms, practices, and privileges. Normal politics or tolerant politics observes these general principles and practices and norms. Okay? And so there were many, many subtypes, but there were 6 main categories that we created when we were classifying different kinds of opposition to populist parties. Rights restrictions, like party bans, restriction of fundings, etc. At the EU level, restriction of EU funds, use of Article 7, Treaty of the European Union, voting sanctions if they had ever been used, ostracism, exclusion of a party from any kind of governing coalition, parliamentary coalition, public events, etc. And coercive confrontation, this was a new category we created, and it involves the suspension of norms of civility, or the principle that in a democracy you engage with people you disagree with using non-violence. So this was a way of capturing violence, not just to people, damage to property, but also the threat of violence. And then normal politics, or tolerant modes of engagement, ordinary legal controls, normal court cases, cases for corruption, cases in the Constitutional Court, cases before the European Court of Justice, for example. These were ordinary legal controls and pedagogy. Forbearance, that was using ordinary kinds of opposition in Parliament against populist parties, but it could also include cooperative strategies in government, such as joining a coalition with a populist party. Now, this may strike you as a little bit odd to use in in a paper or a project looking at opposition. But there's a really interesting strand of literature which helps us focus on the importance of opposition, of cooperation for achieving goals related to support for populist parties in terms of voters and also moderation and radicalization. So that's why that's there. And adversarialism applied norms of civility despite sometimes deep disagreement. So it could include protests, strikes, investigations, information campaigns, etc., etc. That did not entail coercion, threat of coercion. Okay, so that was our framework. And we plotted for each country where these different initiatives lied. This is the aggregate data. And as I said, we're talking about very big general trends. Around 90% of the cases we observed, and we found a lot, 2,835, so really a lot of cases. It's almost all tolerant or normal politics. Quite a small number of cases were these intolerant. Only 231 examples out of over 2,000. So that's one of the big reasons why we talk about normal politics, democratic defense as normal politics. There was some very interesting variation among the cases, and I think this helps qualify and help paint a more complex picture of this idea of normal politics. So what we have here, we have these categories, these in our typology along the bottom, where we have intolerant over this side, and tolerant or normal politics here. So rights restrictions by public authorities, ostracism by political parties, coercive confrontation by civil society actors, etc., etc. And what we did here was to try to understand the proportion of the different initiatives that fell by the different parties. And so we created proportions by finding the cases with the lowest number of rights restrictions, for example, and the highest. And then we created 3 separate categories and basically could characterize cases where there was a high proportion of right restrictions or a low proportion. So here we can see these are the parties along this axis here. Alternative for Germany, the German case. This was the case where there was a high proportion of discussion about rights restrictions, and this was in the context of discussions about classification of Alternative for Germany as an extremist party, a suspected extremist party that could be subject to surveillance by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. So that's a lot of what that is about. Nowhere else, really, did we see this in similar kinds of proportions. Ostracism, exclusion of a populist party from any kind of governing cooperation. That was important in Germany. Constant, you know this, right? It's like you read it almost every second day in the context of any kind of electoral contest where parties say, I will not cooperate. Sweden was an important case, but not anymore. For a long time, the Sweden Democrats were excluded from any kind of cooperation, but now they are a support party for a right-wing government. At the beginning, Vox, people talked about Vox, a right-wing populist party in Spain, in this way, but this didn't last. And this is part of the kind of general movement away from ostracism, and there are very few examples of important or salient populist parties in Europe today that are completely excluded from the party system. It's a bit more mixed in terms of confrontation. Here, this is civil society mobilization that involved usually some low-level kind of threat of violence, sometimes political violence, but most of the time low-level kinds of violence or damage to property, for example. It was also important in Italy in relation to the League, and also in Spain, Podemos and Vox. But you see the picture. It's much weaker on this side of the graph than on this side of the graph. And interestingly, in Hungary and Poland, the cases where democratic backsliding is really profound, we saw hardly any intolerant or exceptional modes of engagement. This was very, very surprising to us. And in fact, in almost all of these cases, the use of tolerant or ordinary modes of engagement was what characterized opposition to Fidesz and law and justice. It was also pretty common in Italy as well, in relation to League and Five-Star Movement. Also, governing parties together at one point. So this was a very normal part of the way in which people engage with populist parties in Italy. And also in Denmark, strikingly, we see that almost all engagement with the Danish People's Party is by political parties, tolerant engagement, co-opting mostly immigration agenda, anti-European arguments to some extent as well. And also, an alternative for Germany, of course, normal politics, tolerant modes of engagement are used in relation to alternative for Germany, of course. But the proportions are really quite different. Okay? We might speak at another time about what might explain some of these patterns, but there's some interesting patterns. And yet we can still make this argument about democratic defense as normal politics. Opposition strategies using the same kinds of repertoires that are used when normal political parties disagree with each other in a democratic country. Okay, I'd like to finish by saying something about how we can think about effective opposition to populist parties. And this is the argument that I tried to develop in this book. Now, you might argue that it's kind of obvious that opposition to populist parties is democratic defense as normal politics. If you think about it, it's kind of what you'd expect in a democracy. But for a long time, the way that people have thought about opposition to populist parties and also other parties is through the lens of militant democracy. And once you realize that actually a lot of what happens in terms of opposition to populist parties is normal politics, it changes the way in which you can answer a whole series of old questions. It changes, for example, the way you talk about normativity. What are the appropriate modes of engagement to populist parties? Because it's less complex normatively to use fairly tried and tested democratic instruments and repertoires. That's less problematic than banning a political party, subjecting it to surveillance, excluding it from the political system. That's one implication of understanding democratic defense as normal politics. Another is how we think about effectiveness, because it draws our attention away from rights restrictions. That's also part of what we can talk about. But actually, social sciences, legal scholarship, has existing theories. It gives a lot of ideas and theories to understand the impact of political interventions that are effectively the same as or analogous to the kinds of initiatives that I've been talking about. So the literature on social movements has theories and ideas and case studies that help us understand the impact of mass demonstrations, for example, or the impact of framing of public political issues in a particular way. The literature on party politics is basically all about how do we understand the success of some parties and the failure of others, and why they change positions in terms of ideological positioning in different dimensions of politics. Literature on international law, an important part of that, or supranational law, EU law, is about what are the implications, or how are EU legislation decisions implemented nationally, and what effects does that have on the political system within member states. We can turn to lawyers to understand the implications and consequences of constitutional court rulings, court cases. So when you start to think about democratic defense as normal politics, all of a sudden we have a huge toolkit for understanding the implications and consequences of different kinds of strategies to oppose populist parties. And so what I tried to do was I built on this knowledge. I built on existing theories and concepts from the social sciences. And I found lots and lots of examples from the secondary literature on populist parties, and developed a framework that in some ways is not very surprising, but which in fact I think helps guide our thoughts away from militant democracy, away from repressive measures and exclusion, towards a theoretical toolkit that we can use to understand the populist parties, important populist parties that we live with today. And so on this side, we have the categories of the typology. You will recognize them. And instead of thinking about the defeat or elimination of populist parties, I think it's more useful to identify goals that people who oppose populist parties try to achieve. And I mentioned these at the beginning. Curbing implementation of illiberal and democratic policies, reducing support for populist parties, diminishing the resources, internal cohesion, financial, human resources, moral resources of populist parties, or inducing moderation. I think it's much more useful, and we have theoretical tools to understand how opposition initiatives can contribute to the achievement of these goals. It's not just goals. If you look at this topic or pay any attention to this topic, we realize pretty quickly we also need to think about perverse effects, that many examples or acts of opposition have unintended consequences. So we also need to theorize how initiatives intended to perhaps reduce support for populist parties might in fact increase support for populist parties. It might increase their moral resources or internal cohesion, or it might lead to their radicalization. So it's quite important, in my opinion, to think about how goals can be achieved, but also how they may relate to different kinds of perverse effects. And what we have here is really mechanisms or the kinds of concepts and theories that can help us understand why these kinds of activities, initiatives, acts of opposition might result in one or other of these things. And I think what I want to do to kind of finish off is to maybe give some examples of goals and mechanisms. Just to give you some examples. I tried to give lots and lots of examples in my book, but I think it helps to understand the argument if I also give you some examples now. So, decreasing support for populist parties. This can include reduction of votes, but also reduction of membership, making it less attractive for people to support in the organizational work that really helps a political party become successful. And even though the trajectory, of course, has been upwards for populist parties in Europe over the last 30 years, of both the left and the right, it's really clear they're a lot more successful than they were 30 years ago. But populist parties lose elections. Their vote share does go up and down individually. The Danish People's Party is a really good example of this. 2015, it had 21% of the vote. Today, it has 2.6% of the vote. You can find many other examples. Five Star Movement had a third of the votes in Italy in 2018, and now it has around 15% of the votes. Populist parties lose power in elections all the time. They not just win elections, but they lose elections, which takes them out of power. This includes Law and Justice in Poland. It lost the elections in 2013. Smer in Slovakia, it lost elections. ANO in Czech Republic, it lost elections and came out of power. Gerb in Bulgaria, it's lost elections several times. These parties come back, they don't disappear, but if our goal is not to understand the disappearance of populist parties, it's worth remarking, it's worth remembering that populist parties lose elections all the time. Reducing resources. When I'm talking about resources, these are attributes or goods that a party has which usually help it win elections. So in many ways it's related to reducing support. So we can talk about financial resources, we can talk about human resources, good leaders, competent, skillful administrators to run an organization. It can include organizational resources, boring, clear procedures, but also internal cohesion. I think that's quite an important element for many political parties. But it can also include moral resources, a sense among supporters at least that what the party is doing is appropriate, it is legitimate in terms of its political goals. All sorts of initiatives opposing populist parties can reduce resources of populist parties. Court cases, for example, they can be quite damaging for a party. It's expensive to put yourself through court. It can be time-consuming. It may tarnish a party's reputation. It doesn't always do this. But this is a cost of initiatives, for example, to deal with corruption, abuse of power. Debatable whether we can say this in relation to hate speech cases. But that's an example of where resources can be depleted. And that's because there can be disagreements within a party about how best to respond. Another example in the case of AfD, for example, think about the consequences in terms of internal cohesion, organizational resources for the whole process of investigating the AfD, surveilling the AfD, its engagement with the security services. This is difficult for a political party to deal with when it has to work out the best way to respond, and it often produces conflicts. I mean, another example of the kind of damage that court cases can do, Morten Messerschmidt, his leader of the Danish People's Party, was involved in a very long court case. He was eventually, the case was dropped. It was to do with misuse of EU funds, similar to the kind of case that we see also in France with Marine Le Pen today. And that's a party that really hasn't properly recovered. This is a guy, his leadership has been tainted by court cases against corruption. In Denmark, it's really a problem for a party to be tainted in a case like this. So initiatives opposing populist parties can be damaging in all sorts of different ways that aren't necessarily about a party just disappearing from the political landscape. We can also talk about moderation of political style. And the modalities for this can be really very varied. For example, Jobbik, the movement for better Hungary in Hungary, it has moderated its style and its policies in quite important ways, moving from being a pariah party to a party that other mainstream parties are willing to cooperate with. It has removed its links or any kind of clear association with the Hungarian Guard, a kind of semi-paramilitary group that would harass Roma in Hungary. And part of this is a response to Fidesz, who stole many of its most radical policies. We can talk about examples of moderation in the face of court cases again, or the example of Flemish interest in Belgium. It moderated its style, reduced some of its most controversial policies after Flemish Bloc, its predecessor, was essentially dissolved because of incitement to hatred cases against it, racism, incitement to racism. More generally, there are strong incentives for political parties to moderate their political positions or their manners, their way of behaving in politics, if they may be welcomed into a coalition government. And it's a strong incentive if a party is office-seeking to moderate its political style or after a period of government. And there's lots and lots of examples where, at least on some dimensions, political parties have done that, including socio-economic, European integration, and importantly for populist parties on anti-elitist positioning and arguments. There are also many examples of initiatives that have curbed implementation of illiberal or undemocratic policies. I mean, people probably think of Hungary and think, yeah, it doesn't really happen very much. They think about the real challenges that the European Union has faced in relation to Hungary, but there's many other counterexamples. We can talk about Italy, for example. Giorgia Meloni has had a lot of trouble implementing an illiberal policy of sending asylums to Albania to have their applications assessed. This was held up by the courts in relation to proper implementation of EU law. In Italy, again, the Constitutional Court 15, 20 years ago did not let Berlusconi introduce a law that would basically protect him from court cases against him. The secondary literature points to the Czech Republic as a country where the courts, the Constitutional Court in particular, has been quite good at preventing introduction of legislation like we've seen in Poland that would undermine the independence of the judiciary. Political parties in the Czech Republic also introduced a law that would constrain Babis, billionaire prime minister heading the Populist party in Czech Republic. And this was parties of the opposition and some coalition partners that introduced a law that would restrict media ownership for cabinet ministers and limited the ways in which rich cabinet members would be able to get access to state funding. So all sorts of examples where we're curbing implementation of illiberal and undemocratic policies. Protests, mass protests, have, in some cases, led to the demise, even if temporarily, of populist governments. Slovakia is a really interesting example. Robert Fico, who's currently Prime Minister in Slovakia, he was kicked out of power in 2018 on the back of mass protests after the killing of a journalist who was investigating crimes that were linked to the Smer party. There are also some examples in Bulgaria of mass protests leading governments to resign or encouraging their coalition parties to step back from coalition agreements with those parties. So there's many examples where we can think of opposition addressing these different kinds of ends. We shouldn't be over-optimistic. There are also many counterexamples. I won't go through them, but there are many examples where the opposite has been the consequence. And so we do have to think about the implications for court cases to increase support, for example, of a populist party. This has been shown, for example, in the Netherlands, where hate speech trials affecting Geert Wilders increased his support in some sections of the community. So there are all sorts of examples that can counter the kinds of examples. But you get the point. You get the point. There are ways, some contexts, through different kinds of modalities in which populist parties as a normal part of the political system can be addressed. And by way of summary, I'm really wanting to finish here. When we talk about mechanisms, we're talking about the ways in which a political intervention, an act of opposition, may achieve one or other of those goals. And I think there's four. I think there's four main explanations or mechanisms by what people do when they disagree with populist parties may have an impact on one or other of these goals. One is a kind of rational choice perspective, manipulation of strategic incentives. For voters, for example, it's less attractive to vote for a party that may never get into government, especially if other parties start to steer the policies that might make it an interesting party for you. It's not really a great idea to vote for a party that might be subject to international sanctions, which somehow might affect your livelihood or your opportunities more generally in your life. For parties themselves, there may be incentives to change their policy and orientations if they are office-seeking. I mean, it's a complicated decision. I mean, it's not a straightforward decision about what kind of policy position you take. But there are incentives if you're an office-seeking party to do that. So there can be some rational choice explanations for how some initiatives can produce some kinds of results. Enforcement of the law. I think we sometimes forget that court rulings, the rulings of a constitutional court, in many cases can be consequential. Even in countries where democratic backsliding takes place. It may not be that all institutions are controlled by governing parties, and they may be a site in which the law can be implemented. Sometimes the law has coercion behind it, the coercive power of the state, the classic definition of the state. But sometimes that's lurking in the background, and it can have an impact which encourages parties to take particular kinds of decisions in the kinds of acts and policies they pursue. Leverage, kind of classic theory of international relations, which helps us understand how interdependence between states in negotiating situations can be a way to affect choices and decisions. It's a way that can help us understand the conditions under which some international initiatives, like the budget conditionality mechanism that the EU is using against Hungary, that it was trying to, or half using, or setting up in relation to Poland. And if a serious Article 7 treaty procedure were used. It helps us understand the conditions, right? If people are clear about, if the people offering the sanctions are clear about what's at stake and what they want, and that the target of those sanctions has something to lose, then that can be a very important way for understanding how international sanctions might work. It can also help us understand how mass protests may make a government, even a government with a majority, pay attention to what protesters want. Because disruptive protests that have a lot of support may disrupt the requirement for peace and stability that many governments require in order to continue. Of course, it's not every case, but this is an argument about understanding the power that movements can have. And that's a fairly classic kind of explanation for why some mass mobilizations are successful, that you can draw from the literature on social movements and the effects of social mobilization. And then, of course, the last one is persuasion. It accepts that the way that you talk about a populist party might be consequential, that the way that issues are framed, that the way that investigators can point out inconsistencies between what a populist says and what a populist party does have consequences. It's an argument about stigmatization, about shaming a populist party, that this can have consequences, particularly for people who might be in doubt about whether or not it's a good idea to support a populist party. Persuasion is precarious, and we've seen a deterioration in information and media environments in recent years. But it is a mechanism. It can operate in different ways, and it can also operate in a way that helps populist parties, opponents of populist parties achieve their goals. So that is a description of my research. There are examples for and against the idea that you can oppose populist parties and achieve certain kinds of goals. I think the kind of conclusion is that if you disagree with populist parties, all hope is not lost. In a democratic state, there are still many ways in which populist parties can be addressed. And I suppose it would be interesting to think a little bit about how these kinds of applications could be used in other countries. I think about it when I think about what's happening in the United States. And I really do think that this is an area where I would be very interested in doing much more research. Because this is at the level of theory at this point, even though there's lots of examples. But this is an invitation, really, to a different way to think about opposition to populist parties, and also an invitation for you to criticize me, to comment, and give me some new ideas for future research.